welcome to the first episode of Pricing Talk. I'm your host, Chris Herbert. With me today is Ismail Madni. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I'm usually far more energetic, but we just had a baby last week. So just thank you. Yeah, it's been fun adding value to the world with more children. That's what we're doing here.
Today we can talk about how to make your kids more money with with higher salaries in the salary survey as I get ready to launch it. Hopefully in the next week or so. We're still waiting on the design and the creative the creative stuff.
Very big deal for our community. Always push it out to folks, make sure people get into it. And if you didn't do it this year, make sure you do it next year. This is absolutely critical for us.
Yeah, it was down this year from like 1350 to like 1200 this year. So for whatever reason, people weren't in the mood, or maybe, more people looking for jobs didn't feel like they could put their current comp or their wanted to put in their past comp. Who knows? But we're definitely doing it.
Yeah, and I imagine it's tough in terms of, as you know, and I know, the last few years, really, I think 2017 onwards, it was somewhat of a bull market for everyone but us in pricing, and those of us who are in technology and SaaS pricing. I was getting calls left and right and was able to easily increase my comp over the years. And this year's been pretty quiet for most folks I know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting just to see the number. Obviously, there's layoffs and stuff can't be avoided as far as looking for a job, but there's a lot of people out there who told me no, they weren't interested for a long time when the market was great, and now we're like, hey, I'm interested in a new job. I'm like, this is not the time. There's just so many more people looking now than there has been. I think the only thing we can compare it to is kind of that early COVID 2020
yep.
after things made the change, but they got back to kind of normal so quickly for most spaces, and then they kind of took off. So it is what it is. But yeah, taking it next year is helpful, and like you said, it adds a ton of value as far as people try to compare pricing to finance or make us fit into another box as far as comp goes, because they don't know what pricing's market rates are. And when you go on to like Glassdoor and other places, I've seen it's just horribly inaccurate because of so few responses in an area that just doesn't work. So
absolutely. Again, I know for myself, this salary survey has been absolutely critical for me in negotiations and deciding on offers and just having a sense of where do I fit in the market. So I always feel very confident when I have these discussions. I haven't had these discussions in a while. I'm very satisfied and happy where I'm at. But
it's been like a year. It's not that long. Come on.
It's not that long, but it would be multiple times a year at some point. Just someone calls you and you just have that initial discussion. But to your point, Chris, I know just the value this has been for me. And if you look at Glassdoor, if you look at where we try to fit, or if you're switching industries like I did and didn't have a clue going from my previous world of government contracting into SaaS, I just did not realize the salary structures and how they were. So just to be educated on it, the more folks we have do this, the better for all of us.
I think it too helps just if you're getting a raise internally, or, comp discussions internally, or getting a promotion internally. I mean, a lot of times they're going off of, basic stuff and not going off what the market actually is. So being able to use this to kind of reset yourself, or say, hey, you're going to lose me, not the market to probably have that conversation, but other years to kind of have that chat. So anyways, let's get into kind of some of our thoughts, some of the analysis. So I'll start with some quick high level stuff. So this year, I think we're going to have 30 cities, probably 15 industries. So up from, I want to say we had 11 industries last year. I was able to do 15 this year. The cities fell, I think, from 33 down to 30 this year, just because there weren't enough people. Even though we were kind of going, Drew on my team and I were going door to door, asking people to take it, saying, "Hey, we're going to lose your city if you can't help us out." So, anyways, only lost 3, which isn't too bad. Some high level stuff. So even though, this started back early in the year, I think before the market fully shifted. So take that kind of into consideration with some of these numbers. But in the people that said they changed to a new role or a new job in the last 6 months, their raises fell to less than 14% from 18% the 6 months 6 months prior to taking it last year. So, that's 4% that people are losing getting new roles this year compared to the prior year, which is, I think, pretty significant. Raises also fell to stay at companies from 5.5 to less than 4.5. So 1% that companies are not, in this market, not gonna give you as big of a raise to stay. Fully remote work was over 50% of the people hired, I think 55%. So remote still going strong, in this market, in a company market, that may shift a little bit. So interested to see what happens next year with that number. The industry that paid the most to get new talent, to steal people away, was the legal industry. So I think they were giving raises on average of around 17%. So they kind of led the way in paying the biggest price for stealing people away and bringing them, kind of giving them open market raises. So any thoughts on that stuff?
Well, what's interesting to me is, again, switching jobs typically gets you the most bang for your buck. That's just reality. And the spread, again, last year's about 13%, whether you stay and get 5% or whether you go and get on average 18%. Now that spread is down to less than 10%, around 9.5%, just reading the numbers. So to me, that's interesting. And it makes me wonder if part of it, again, just speaking for SaaS only, there were fewer openings this year, from what I could tell, fewer senior level openings. A whole bunch of us, again, over the last few years took advantage of the market, got ourselves better comp. So we potentially could have already maxed out at the level we're at. And in some scenarios, in conversations I've had, going to another level from where I'm at would not be even 13%, would be 10 or 9%. So it's interesting to me that it is almost, do you leave for maybe 10% more? I don't know. So it may slow the market down for some of us going forward.
I'd say more people are still aggressive and they're less confident with where they are, so they're moving. But I think you bring up a better point of, people getting paid. And if you stay at a role and you stay at a company for a long period of time, you're getting underpaid and you're essentially losing money every year that you stay. So, if you think about that, if on average people are changing jobs every 2 years, if you're staying for 4 years, you've missed out, on a 10% raise plus that on top of it. So you're probably, 15% or whatever the math is, but you're 15% below the market. And a lot of people want, have said with the salary survey, well, can you show years of experience? I can, but do you want to be insulted? Because the difference between how many years you worked or how long you've been at the role, you'd think kind of how long you've been at the role, you'd be making more, but people coming in to roles, honestly, a lot of times with less experience are getting paid just as much, if not more.
Or more.
Yeah, or more than their incumbents. And usually the people who have more experience and have come in recently are the ones making the most. It's, it's almost like sports. You get paid, you get paid the most when you hit the open market and when you're able to become a free agent. Like you're predictable with where you are, but if you want to get paid, you got to, you honestly have to take your talent somewhere else. Obviously this may not be the market to do it, and you may want kind of to, stay where you are and kind of be a little bit more secure, especially if you're happy in your job right now. But, you have to capitalize when the markets are good and take that raise, or else every year that you're staying, you're losing,
you are left behind. And I think, again, and folks can look at my LinkedIn. I've definitely jumped around, and I'm not afraid of that. And I've been recruited to different places. And again, these were significant jumps. Had I stayed in the same place I was at 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I wouldn't be anywhere close, not even close to the compensation I'm at now. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And Chris, I think you bring a good point. If you're happy where you're at now in this market, it's probably a safe bet to stay there, especially as we've spoken about before, companies don't always know the role we do, may not have the best infrastructure, may not have you set up for success. And especially with the market pressures and macro pressures and pressures on companies right now, it may just be a better play to take the stability and take the security for the next 18 to 24 months, and then look to capitalize when things get real hot again.
Yeah, and I don't think, you're not going to lose a ton in the short term, but it also goes to, if we're getting into like how to make the most money, honestly, the biggest driver, if you look at the salary survey, something that I think gets overlooked for its obviousness is the level, right? So the biggest value to you is your title, is your level. That's the number one thing on how you're compensated, is your title. And, if you're staying where you are and you like what you're doing, hey, that's great. But if your goal is to make the most and for your career, you have to get the title bumps. And those are, I kind of, I have a hard time saying it to people when I'm doing recruiting, and like, I try not to sell them on new roles with it a ton, but I'll be like, look, I think this role is worth $100,000 to you. Or I talked with and helped place a VP the other day. Honestly, I think the title bump, I think I told him $500,000, but I could have argued $1 million. I could have argued probably $2 million that the title is worth to him. He's getting into that next level, that next club. And with some of these cities, you'll see an experienced director is paid more than a first-time director, because they've almost kind of created this, like, companies are willing to pay more for that experienced director just because there's not as many levels for us above director. And so there's kind of this artificial, it's not necessarily, and you'll see even with some cities, senior director is paid less or just as much as the directors. And so it's more of an experienced director versus an inexperienced director. And I see it with my clients. It's like, well, we're not really willing to pay more. It's like, okay, well then I'm going to need to go find you a senior manager, right? You're going to need to promote this person, and they may not have the same, leadership and experience that way, but you're going to be able to afford them versus, it's 50, 100 grand more sometimes, for an experienced director. So titles, while it's probably obvious, that is your biggest, your biggest bang for your buck, and how to make yourself the most money in your career is leaving for a new role with a higher title. And if anyone tells you otherwise, I'm happy to have a chat with them.
Well, not only that, Chris, not only just with, to your point, getting that club, but you going from a senior manager where you're probably making an 8 to 10% bonus to a director, senior director, where your bonuses are in the 20 to 25% range. I think
somewhere
VP
as high as 40.
VP, yeah.
Right. So,
yeah. And VPs hit that.
Yeah. And you're, I think once you get to the director level, a lot of the bump really comes in form of stock or equity.
Yep.
That's, and as you look at it, you look at the salary survey, that's where these people, especially in the software world, are making $1 million because they're getting, 750 on, on equity or something crazy like that a year. So, your base will keep going up a little bit, but it starts to, early in your career, you go to manager, or from senior analyst to manager, most of that's coming in the form of a base raise, versus later on in your career, it keeps going up. But the biggest bump as far as percentages go, comes in the form of equity, as you're paid.
Absolutely.
You're paid for more performance, right? Hey, we do better, you do better, and they want you more invested. And so, and just a good rule of thumb too for people, as far as the equity goes, and kind of understand where companies are coming from, and you have to value them, make them feel good about it, even if you want more on the base. Don't insult the company. Well, I'm not really don't really want your stock as much. Don't say that. Seen that a few times recently. It is what it is, and there's just, ways to have these conversations when you're negotiating, right? You have to think about it from a pricing perspective, and think about it like dealing with sales. I think is the best way to, best way that I can, use to explain.
But believe it or not, too, at times when equity seems unattractive, it's probably the most attractive it's going to be. Imagine if you joined a SaaS company last year at this time, when the market had really hit hard, and some former companies of mine had been down 80 to 90% from the COVID peak around this time last year, and have doubled from this time last year. So they looked very unattractive, the equity, because the stock is tanked. That's probably when it's most attractive, because the upside is there, versus going to a company that, just, again, imagine joining a place in September 2021, you were down 80% on your equity a year later. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, Chris, I think you bring up a great point, that as you get more experience, and where the money really comes in is on that front. There's going to be a ceiling in base at some point, but with your bonuses and the equity amount, that's where you can potentially into the high six figures and, below seven figures. And I know in the salary survey, there are a few folks out there who are in that seven-figure range. Not me. I would love to be there one day, but there's other folks out there who are at companies where more than likely, 80% of that comes from equity.
Yeah, and most of the time, I think it's it's one of two things, especially with companies going public, where people are making a bunch, or the VPs, you're getting a ton of stock, and if the company's doing well, I mean, that's the one place I think where staying does make sense, if your equity and your stock's going through the roof, versus jumping to a company that you may not
absolutely
know where they're gonna be. But anyways, so kind of on to the next one. We probably could talk for an hour just on that alone. But as far as kind of the highest paying, we'll get into the highest paying cities and lowest paying cities. So I think we all can probably guess there's factors here that involve, I didn't go and take out industries and stuff like that. So I really just looked at like an average of the cities and the responses, and kind of averaged, like, depending on the level, senior analyst to director, or manager to director, or did a combination of the both to see, like, hey, these, who's getting paid the most, who's getting paid, the least on average. So highest paying, no surprise, the Bay Area. And in that same vein, through tech, Seattle and Austin are kind of right there. I didn't, and I should preface this with, like, the cities that only had like a few responses, I can't compare everything, and I didn't have time to do a weighted analysis or other stuff. This was more just, quick and dirty. So I don't think there's any surprise there to you with kind of those cities.
No, not at all. No. Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, maybe a little bit being up there, but it does make sense considering folks who may have been remote moving here. Not only that, you've got big tech companies here as well. They're moving operations. You have an AMD, NVIDIA has a presence, Dell has a presence here. So it's not surprising. San Francisco, obviously, Seattle makes complete sense as well.
Yeah, and we should preface that Ismail is in Austin, so he knows the knows the area well. I think kind of with the lowest cities, I'll just run through them, and then we can get into kind of, I think, one thing that always kind of jumps a little bit out to people. So lowest cities: Chicago, Houston, LA, DC, Nashville, Atlanta. Of the cities that had a lot of responses, obviously there's going to be some other cities in there, but those kind of all stuck around the same area as far as where they were. So I kind of grouped them all together. I think the big surprise there is LA to people. But if you think about the industries that are in LA, I think LA probably could have been the lowest if it wasn't propped up by tech. But the industries that they have in LA, and honestly, the compensation in LA has been one where it's not what it should be. And I think going back years when I adjusted for cost of living, LA and New York were among the two worst. Just because when you factor everything in, they don't pay what they should pay for what it costs to live there. And the common thread I think about those places too is Chicago probably has one of the biggest pricing markets, but the industries there aren't high paying industries. The cost of living isn't huge. Houston, lower cost of living.
Yep.
I would have almost thought oil and gas maybe would push that up, but I don't think we got very many oil and gas this year. I think they didn't want to participate, and no offense if anyone's listening from those spaces. DC, the DC market better since you're from there.
Yeah, it's not a surprise considering government contracting, the rates, and how so much of your cost of government is based on your costs internally and how much goes into, folks know the acronym BNP, bid and proposals. You want to keep that low. You want to keep your G&A costs low. So when you do bid to government, you can come in with a very competitive bid and do well on behalf of the taxpayers. So DC typically, because of the industry, primarily government contract, I'd say 95% of pricing professionals there are primarily focused on government contracting or working for a contractor with a significant chunk of government business. That's number one. Number two, there are lots of them because, again, just proposals and proposal season as they come up. So it's no surprise. And there is a ceiling, I think, over there. There are a few people I know who have broken through and make very good money, but for the most part, you're going to hit a ceiling that is much lower than the ceiling in San Francisco or the ceiling in Seattle or even Boston, I imagine. I don't remember off the top of my head what Boston was. It's probably higher.
And we did take out, senior directors and VPs weren't really in this just because not every area had it. So it was a little too hard to compare fully apples to apples of everything. Like I said, kind of quick and dirty. But yeah, all that makes sense. And obviously Nashville, Atlanta, I don't think there's any
smaller markets.
Any surprise there, lower cost of living, and not to say these are the absolute lowest given there's other areas we didn't look at. I only probably looked at like 10, 15 areas that had enough for me to kind of do a legitimate analysis that I could at least stand behind. And kind of as we were talking about the markets or the industries, I think I also looked at the industries as well. Obviously we only had 15 of them and some had enough responses, some didn't. But going back to what we were saying, software was number one. I don't think is going to surprise anybody. Just put out a LinkedIn post. I'm sure it's probably going to be in the responses is what people think is going to be the highest. The one that surprised me was consulting, which, I wasn't expecting to be there. I think they pay well, usually early on in the career, given how much they ask you to work. Your per hour compensation is probably much lower, but into the director level, they were holding they were holding up better. And I know in talking with people and folks there, I know they have been having to do some things where they've even had to do releveling to try to get people to the right level. So they had to kind of essentially just be like, okay, yeah, you guys are getting stolen away far too often. And my apologies for doing that. But I think they did do some releveling. And so I think that may have helped a little bit, and they've given some raises, but I do think that falls off a little bit at that senior director, and definitely I think depending on the industry, it falls off a little bit. I did see some, especially in the software space, where there wasn't necessarily, that high, you're kind of locked in at a rate versus you can't get that high end from them. So the average may be okay, but that high, you're not getting the high end with the consulting. So I think that one's pretty straightforward. Do you think?
Yeah, and again, I think you know that world much better than I do, just with your experience there. But it's not a surprise, and I'm wondering if at the top end, the folks who actually make money are more so selling services. Yes, they do pricing and they are pricing consultants, but they're the ones responsible for being the face and bringing people in versus doing the work itself.
At the director level, I think they're starting to learn that and starting to kind of take on a little bit more of that. But anyways, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I don't think anyone's horribly surprised. The lowest paying were kind of wholesale, automotive, logistics and transportation, and retail. And so that's kind of, I think I look at senior analyst to director and then manager director, and looked at the two, since, not every industry had things, but those kind of stuck out. I think retail, I was a little surprised by.
Do you think it's because, again, I don't have retail experience or much experience in those industries, but just thinking about, because so you have such large quantities, there's a cost plus element to it. So it may not, and this is not to insult anyone, may not be as sophisticated. You're dealing with algorithms, obviously, and looking at market dynamics, but it's very different from a value-based approach, right? So perhaps you're going to see that's where a place where AI might already be there and start to come into play more and more.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely where software is a lot more prevalent. But I think too, that now that I think about it, I mean, where the retailers are located, they're not, I mean, I know Bed Bath and Beyond, and there was a few since gone was in the New York area, but I think probably most of the people weren't from those, that maybe the higher markets. I do think that changes at the higher levels of retail, in that if you're in charge of running this organization and you were able to bring in millions and millions of dollars, I think more so for me, the retail, they could add so much value that's kind of where my surprise comes in. The teams are usually a little bigger, but I have seen some lack of willingness to pay at the lower levels, but I see that everywhere. All my clients would love to pay as little as possible, or not pay the pricing, we'll say the pricing premium that I usually have to explain to them over, what they came to me wanting to spend.
Yeah. Again, I think that industry just don't have enough insight there, but to your point, PG&E being in Cincinnati and Target being in Minneapolis, it isn't a surprise when you do add in the location factor as well.
Yeah, you've got Minneapolis, you've got Dallas, you've got
Walmart is in Arkansas.
Yeah. So, but to be honest, and defend the industry, there's a lot of people making a lot of money and living in low cost places. So
good for them.
I don't feel bad. Sometimes I see them, I'm like, whoa, you probably could buy your house off your annual comp, which would be nice. Not in the places that you and I live, although Austin's,
sadly,
yeah. Anyways,
Austin's
all right.
No longer cheap.
I think people were asking last year about, okay, well, public company versus private company. So I put in who owns the company this year as far as PE, private company, or public. So, I tried to look at that when applicable. There are a few times in the salary survey where you'll see it come into play, where you'll see me mention it. I want to say I knocked PE, I want to say in the consulting world. There maybe one or two consulting firms that are owned by private equity and paid noticeably less, but they also were in locations that paid less. So can't necessarily say, but there was something there. And then in CPG, there was one industry where it was like public company, private company, PE company. I'm like, wow, that's the first time I've seen anything I can use, let alone this just being completely obvious to me as I'm looking through it. And honestly, I mean, I'm not, I'm trying to find things and I'm trying to get enough information to be able to actually put it out there. I don't want to be like, well, one person's making a ton and not. And so this was one where it was like they were grouped together in terms of lowest paying, middle paying, highest paying. And so for CPG, I want to say it was manager or some level like that. There was a clear divide. Other than that, I really couldn't find much as far as who owns the company affecting how people are compensated.
But I do think it's something that, and again, especially in software, people need to keep in mind. If you are at a public tech company and you are getting RSUs, for example, that is real if you stick it out long enough. In a year, you'll get a quarter of them, and then, quarterly from that point forward, you're getting real money.
Depending on your vest. Yep.
Exactly. And that's real. So you take that into consideration. Maybe you're willing to take a slightly lower base there because there is that real equity RSU upside a year from now and every quarter thereafter. Whereas if you're at a venture-backed company, obviously the expectation is you'd get a bigger payoff. You'd have more options and much more that you can measure. So you join venture-backed and maybe you're not getting as much of a base comp as you would expect. And then PE is interesting enough because those are typically vesting in over 3 years or 5 years. You're not getting that 1 year vest. So it's something to keep in mind that you may not feel the upside of your performance based on what type of company you're at, and to think about how you negotiate and how you want your base compensation to be structured versus, again, public versus a private equity owned company. Big difference in when that equity upside comes in.
Well, I think you bring up a good point too of, how confident in the role you're taking, that needs to factor into what industry or who owns it, right? If you're super confident and this is a long-term fit, then go for it, right? But if you're not going to get the comp unless you stay for 3 years, you need to be like absolutely sold that you're not going to get run out the door in a year. I mean, honestly, in some of these, especially in the software world, I mean, the success rate of a first time pricing hire, I mean, what would you guess? 75%? You think that's too much?
Right. Yeah. I think that's high. Yeah. I mean, the first time pricing strategy person, we've talked about it before. It is a very challenging, difficult job unless you have high senior level backing. And usually you have to educate. No, by the way, those senior level leaders often leave. The people who hired you may not be there in a year. So it is to your point. If you're going to a place where your pricing strategy hire number one, and maybe it's public, maybe it's private, that goes into it. And how confident are you that, hey, I will be here 3 years from now to see the equity upside of this versus, well, let me just go to a public company and get that equity upside in the year. I think those are definite factors to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it should be factored into your consideration too, and what your goal is with that role, right? I mean, if you're trying to get from senior manager to director, and you're trying to get that comp, then you're trying to get that bump and that title. You should probably be more willing to take on a risk, take on a situation, absolutely. Because once you're at that level, you're marked for that.
You're good.
Yeah. And so getting that is a reason. But if you're trying to, play it safe or get the most comp, I mean, private companies is the guarantee, right? And so you need to make sure you're kind of factoring that into your decision. And that also goes into another thing that we've talked about for years is like, how do you figure out the success rate of that job, right? Like how in the interview process do you vet, is this a role I have a chance of being successful? And I know we've talked about it a lot. Maybe we can get into some of those things of like what we look at or because I know we've talked about it a lot. So what do you look at as far as like red flags or things that make you feel confident that they're going to give pricing a fair shake or open to make the changes they need to?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and something we struggle with. And I've often called hiring managers as well, who I know when they're posting a first-time role, and I'll be very specific because of my experience tending to be pricing strategy hire number one at multiple places. I've been through it. But first of all, what is your scope? Like what level are you at? Are you just a senior manager who's coming in as a pricing strategist? Okay. Or are you at a director, ideally a VP level, where they're going to give you the ability to actually build the function? And let's be real, building a function means having people. You can't have just one pricing person. This is a pricing function doing many different things. So you do need resources. So I think number one, leveling. Number two, is the company committed to giving actual resources? Number three, where do you sit? Are you reporting into a senior director, for example? It's probably not the right place, and your success, there's probably limited upside. Or are you reporting into a C-level? And more importantly, a C-level who, in my opinion, I'd rather have a C-level with influence and someone who, again, won't be kicked out in 3 months or 6 months. Chris, you know this, I've been in places where I've had 4 managers in 9 months, right? That's not a good situation.
I mean, at the end of the day, how many roles between you and I have we gone into and the boss has actually stayed longer than a year, or heck, stayed longer than 6 months?
Man, that's a very good question. I'd say the last 2 roles I've been at, I have not had, and maybe it's just me, who knows? Maybe I'm the problem here, but the last 2 roles, I've not had managers there longer than 6 months. I think the longest has been 6 months. I know a few roles ago, had a great manager who'd been there a year, and I've, among those groups who leave early, there were some great managers and others who weren't great. So it is very difficult for a first-time pricing strategy hire to then build momentum and start to get some wins. Because again, how we operate, it compounds, right? You're not going to see very much in the beginning, then suddenly it starts to hockey stick. And if you're starting over, 2 to 3 times a year with a new manager, makes it very difficult to see that hockey stick and to see the big wins start to happen.
And I mean, you never know if they're going to believe in pricing, right? I think, like
right.
you said, it's what's the commitment? Who's leading this charge to bring in the pricing person? I think if you're looking for a job and you want to be stable in pricing, go to it where there's you're reporting into a pricing person, right? Especially early in your career, try to go to people that know the pricing world, know people, impress somebody. But later in your career, it becomes more challenged because you're having to lead its function and you're having to report into somebody who either thinks they know pricing or admits they know nothing about pricing. What's more dangerous? I'd probably say the people that think they know pricing.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That's always a little bit of a challenge, but I mean, I think you kind of walk through most of the things too. How much? I also look at how much are they willing to pay? Have they had? Asking about it. Have they? What happened with the prior person? What didn't work out? I think trying to talk to as many people within the organization. So, I mean, any organization you go into, there's going to be a person who maybe doesn't believe in pricing or is just a jerk or whatever it is. But if you know that going in, you know who you have to work on more, you know who you have to put in more time with, right? Versus if you talk to one or two people and you sign up and you're going in blind. Like you don't even know the
Absolutely.
challenge in front of you. And also sometimes it's the people that don't talk to you during an interview process. You need to mark them down as like, all right, well, I need to go get a drink with this guy or invite her to coffee or whatever it may be to figure out like, if they shoot you down, then hey, this is going to be your challenge.
You bring up such a good point I know when we interview, it's a pain in the ass, right? You don't want to have to interview with 8 people or 9 people. But in our role in particular, since we touch everything, and to your point, Chris, there may be someone you didn't speak to who has much more influence than you thought and has no skin in the game for you whatsoever because they weren't part of your interview panel or is a jerk and you need to work on whatever it is. I highly encourage, and especially in tech, folks who are going into a role as the first pricing strategy hire to speak to every single C-level possible, in particular, the CFO, the chief product officer, chief salesperson, whether it's commercial, revenue officer, whatever that title is, engineering, even customer success, just across the board so that you have touched all of them. And if you do take the job, they had some skin in the game and still saying yes to you coming on board. And if you aren't allowed to speak to all of those folks, then that could be a red flag right there. But I absolutely encourage, and again, I know it's a pain and you want to lock the job down, but to your point, Chris, you need to know what you are walking into, and you need to be ready to go on day one as much as possible, just to get some quick wins and have the relationships early on because of the cross-functional nature of our role.
And I think too, just kind of came to me if I were doing it, talking to the person who's been doing the pricing, right? Like if they're like, oh, so-and-so's does the pricing in finance, does it for like 10% of his job or 50% of his job, or he's doing it right now, trying to have a conversation with that person and figure out where the bodies are buried already, or excuse me, or how hard is it to drive pricing change? At least you know what you're walking into and you have more information, and also getting in good with that person, early on so that you can figure that stuff out, because sometimes these hurdles, that the second or third pricing person who finally makes it successful is because they now have more information, or they're now being told more, or they've just had to run through the gauntlet and now they've worn down the other people, or worn down sales for you, whatever it may be. So yeah, it sounds like getting as many interviews, talking to as many folks. I know in a market like this, it's tougher to push for that, because if you're out of work or a job's ending or you really need to get out, you're kind of more focused on, you're just, I need that role, I need to jump into it, but try to ask for as many conversations and things. And if that loses you the job, was it going to be something that would have lasted longer than 6 months anyways?
Right.
You kind of have to kind of take the good with the bad with some of this stuff.
Yeah. And again, I think the worst thing is for you to walk into a place where the key people are like, who the hell is this that just showed up here and is suddenly doing pricing? Whether it is a chief product officer, a chief financial officer, or chief revenue officer, whomever, right? You don't want to end up showing up to a place and they don't know who you are, or they don't know you're starting. So that's why it's very important, to your point, Chris, vet the manager, vet that
how many times have you walked in and people didn't know you were, they'd hired a pricing person?
All right, let me see. Oh, it happened early on, when my first pricing leadership roles, and I quickly realized, all right, let's not let that happen again. So I've made sure not to have it happen again since then. But yeah, it's something that's happened, right? You show up and they're like, wait, what are you doing here?
Our pricing's
type deal.
fine.
No, we don't want to involve that. No, like, we don't really have much for you to do. And they complain to your boss, and suddenly, it turns into a negative situation. So from my perspective, you want to be ahead of that. Because, Chris, you're recruiting and you're on this. You're talking about how important it is, how much we need this role, et cetera. To, well, one person who's doing it right now, and it's a pain in the ass, needs a role, or there's one leader, or, there's a PE person that really wants this role, but maybe the rest of the leadership doesn't care and doesn't want it. So again, trying to just have everyone have a little skin in the game for you is important. So if you have gone through the gauntlet and have spoken to the senior level C-suite leaders, and you come on board, they were at least part of your process, and they were people who at least said yes to you coming on board, which makes them a little more vested in you succeeding versus someone wondering, wait, who's that pricing person we just hired last week?
Or you run into, oh, well, I do pricing now. It's like,
right.
Not anymore.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I think it's very important to be willing to have those conversations.
So that's kind of at the higher level. I think, maybe get into some career advice or some salary advice for people in the younger or earlier aspect of their career. My thoughts, look at what your objectives are, at least for the more junior people, what your objectives are, what you're trying to do. If you're trying to maximize your compensation, I think switching industries, don't be afraid to take a lateral or take a step back to get into a different field that may have, may take you, 4 or 5 years to double what you're, what you would be making in another role. I think also too, as far as, a strategy, like I said, finding good pricing people to work for that know what they're doing,
100%,
that are going places too, because you can get taken with you. I mean, the people that I've seen do the best in their career, it's not what they know, and it's not how good they are. It's who they know, who they impressed, especially early in their career. And then their career took off like a rocket ship because, hey, they took them with them, and, the sky's the limit for them.
Yeah, absolutely. That to me is key. I was very blessed early in my both government contracting career and in my SaaS career to have really outstanding managers. One outstanding manager in SaaS that I still rely on, still consider a friend, and multiple in government contracting career where I learned skills I could apply. And to your point, Chris, you get with the right person, you will get taken somewhere else. I know that, I've seen people.
I know you're talking about somebody who we're just talking about taking the same person with them.
Right.
I mean, it does, at some point you need to go out and do your own thing, and, that becomes the challenge. But I think anybody, finding a mentor these days is tough to do. I don't know that I've ever had that in my career. Like you said, I mean, especially early in my career, every time I took a job, my boss left, and then you're left with, with someone else bringing in their own team. And it's like, all right, this is awkward. Guess I need to find something else because, I'm not his or her, guy or girl or whatever whatever the situation is. So I've I had that happen a lot, which, hey, maybe that's why I ended up backing into recruiting, which I still joke with people. I have no idea how it happened, but it happened.
Worked well. 100% agree.
Anything else as far as, career or salary for young people? I mean,
for young people, salary, again, pay attention. Look at the survey every year. Just keep a pulse on the market. Talk to people. I'll tell you this much. I get very frustrated when I see certain roles go that I may have been at or folks didn't reach out to ask. The more we are transparent and share information, the better. So go into these discussions very educated. And we have an amazing community thanks to the efforts Chris has put in the last few years. And again, as Chris mentioned, finding the right leader to attach yourself to if possible. Getting in the right company, the pricing leader who knows what they're doing, is willing to teach, and impressing them will go a long way. The last thing I'll add to that as well, just being generally curious about pricing, how we do our jobs, learning different, the amount that I learn every year and how my thoughts on different strategies change. Because I talk to folks and I'm genuinely curious. So stay curious and just keep your eye on what's happening, understand the trends, and be willing to do that little bit of work on your own.
Something you said jogged my memory of a conversation we've had is pricing people don't talk to one another well enough right now, especially about jobs. Like if someone just left a job, why are we not reaching out and being like, hey, I'm interviewing for a job that you just had. Can you give me some insight or help me be more successful or let me know something, right? Like, I don't know why there isn't more of those conversations being had in the community. I'm always happy to facilitate those, those conversations. I'm always happy to when people reach out and be like, hey, I'm, got a job offer. Like, what do you think? Like, I'm happy to look at that and like, be like, hey, the salary survey says you're right on, or, yeah, you may want to go higher. I think a lot of people take less and make the mistake of, especially when you're younger, taking the first offer. And something I tell my candidates to say, like, unless it's a number that you've already had conversations with them about, and you've kind of already made it clear what you want. My school of thought is you're being asked to price their product or service. Why should they shouldn't be hiring you unless you're good at pricing yourself. And so If you're not countering back with like, I don't care if you ask for $1 more or like $50 more or $1,000 more, but if you don't ask for $1 more, like, are you really the right person for the job? Like, as long as you do it in a respectful way and you don't make some outlandish request above where they are, usually they'll negotiate with you, or they'll, at worst case, they come back and, hey, look, Chris, we're already at the top of the range. There's nothing I can do. That sometimes will happen. And the hard part is to take emotion out of it. I mean, I made that mistake in my early in my career where, I was told, oh, it's going to be, we're in the XYZ range. And then they didn't get there. And I'm like, no, your recruiter told me. And like, oh, well, she must have misspoken. And I'm like, this is just a bad feeling. And, my emotional reaction was, F you. Like, not taking the job. Either you give me what you told or I don't want it. And it was probably only a few $1,000s, to be honest. And I think, that's one mistake I think people make early in their career is passing on a promotion or passing on a great opportunity over a small amount of money, because you have to look at this from a long-term perspective. That title, if you're passing on it for $3,000 and you're getting a title promotion, like you're going to make back, in no time, 10x that, 20, 100x that, I would say. Like, that title has value to you. And so don't be as concerned. Look at the salary survey, look at how much the comp goes up with every title and every level. The amount you're going to be making down the line is triple, quadruple what you're making early in your career. Don't make the mistake of cutting yourself off or hurting future earnings by worrying about a small amount of money. Take the experience, take the titles as you can get them, especially analyst, senior analyst, manager. Like, take them, take the great opportunities. Don't, it's easy for me to say, it's hard in practice as we have bills to pay and stuff like that. But, take the long approach. Like, think about this as a game of checkers or chess. What is 2 steps ahead for you? And don't just take a role without thinking. And I try to get all my candidates to think about, okay, yeah, role's great, but what does this mean for you? What does this lead you to in your next role? And trying to get them in like, all right, this is great, but here's where I see this taking you, your next role? Is that what you're looking for? Making sure we're on the same page.
100%. Yeah. Can't add any more to it. Absolutely agree with that.
Since this is our first, or my first one, hey, follow whatever platform I'm going to post this to, help out that way, let people know. We're going to talk more with Ismail, talk more with, different pricing experts, get into other stuff around how to be successful in a pricing role, how to come into a pricing job, how to drive change within the organization, what to do in the first 90 days, how can we help pricing people be more successful in their roles, make more money, share thought leadership, share different ideas, where's the pricing industry going? I mean, you mentioned kind of AI on the retail world, but where are we going from in the software space? Where are we going in the legal space? Let's talk about these things. Let's try to share ideas from different areas, and hopefully that gives people different values. So I appreciate the time. I know you probably have to get back to a feeding or something with any one of your kids, but I appreciate the time.
Anytime. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.